So let's do the John Doyle, shall we? John Doyle talking about the supposed debunking of systematic racism. Someone also who's a fan of John told me to, look at this. And he hasn't put out anything new since the last time we covered him, so I guess we'll continue, shall we?
About wealth now. So the idea is basically that the reason that there's such a large gap in the wealth between an average black family and an average white family is because of things like slavery crippling black people, racist lenders refusing black people loans for homes, earning less money.
Yes, the Civil Rights Act wasn't passed until 1969, and a mortgage is roughly 30 years on... An average home loan is like a 30-year home loan. Actually, the average might be a little less, because some people take 15-year loans. But, 1969 plus 30 years, your average, black family, first-generation homeowner is only going to pay off their home in, the year 1999. The year The Matrix came out is the time that, it's 1964? Either way, mid-90s. So, in the mid-90s, you're playing your Tamagotchi. Meanwhile, first-generation black homeowners are finally owning their homes. Meanwhile, we have tons of white Americans, and I'm not saying all of them. There are plenty of families who don't have generational home ownership. I understand that. But, we're talking about averages here, because we're talking about statistics. So your average, white homeowner in the 90s is probably not going to be a first-generation homeowner. It takes, generations to build equity and wealth. So black people in this country have been at a disadvantage and continue to be at a disadvantage because, what do you know, being slaves and then being freed but still being discriminated against and not being allowed to buy homes due to loan discrimination, discrimination in employment, discrimination even if you have the money, they're not going to let you move into certain neighborhoods, and you're basically going to have to go live in, ghettos because we're, discriminating against people and splitting up people by race in the city. These are things that ripple forward even after, by law, we change how these things are done, right? For instance, I live in Saginaw, okay? There's this area in Saginaw that's, very downtown, and it is sort of considered the bad part of the city, and the majority of the population in that part of the city happens to be black. Now, there's no law that makes, mostly black people live on that part of the city, but on that part of the city, real estate prices are lower, and again, systematically, black people have been disadvantaged in such a way that over time they haven't been able to build equity or build wealth for themselves generationally that can be passed on to their children, whether in the form of literal inheritance or better schooling, which leads to better outcomes. Then you end up in a situation, well, by law, people can live wherever they want and do whatever they want. But by fact, things are unequal because equality, or because outcome, even if we're not looking for equality of outcome, we don't have equality of opportunity, right? Because John, for instance, who lives in his parents' house, which is fine, but he never mentions it, interestingly. John, who lives in his parents' house, right, has a lot more opportunities than someone who maybe rents a place with their parents, or lives with their parents who rents a place downtown. You know what I mean? His parents probably have some wealth, whether it's liquid cash, whether it's investments, or whether it's an equity in their home. So if John wanted to go to college, I don't think he wants to, because I think he thinks college is for, liberal elites or something. He would have the opportunity to do so, but instead he does other things. For instance, this. He's able to build his business out of his parents' house, right? Something that other people who are less advantaged wouldn't have the opportunity to do. And I'm glad John has the opportunity to do what he wants outside of the fascist shit. But, that's a material thing you can look at and say, hey, look at the differences between different races of people and the reasons for those differences.
money because of racism in the workplace and fewer educational opportunities because of racism. All this has led to white families having a lot more money and then passing that down throughout generations, and black families not being able to do that because of racism. So this assumes a few things. We'll go through them one at a time. The first thing I want to start with is slavery. There's this vague narrative that is simply that because of slavery hundreds of years ago, black Americans are disadvantaged in society. Besides the obvious evilness of slavery, they were also stunted in terms of literacy, occupational and economic mobility, and education. Now, since we can point to examples of systemic racism against black Americans even after slavery was abolished, the best way that we could test the residual effects of slavery on black Americans would be by comparing the descendants of freed black people to the descendants of black people who were born enslaved, because
No, because even though people who may have been freed black people during slavery, they still had the fallout of what happened after slavery was made illegal, right? It doesn't matter if you go into a bank and ask for a home loan and you're like, oh, I may be black, but I was never a slave. I was freed. The fucking loan officer doesn't care. That's how racism works. They don't care if you were a slave or not.
if we just compared either group to the average American or to anyone else, it's not going to take anti-black discrimination into account. And so research has been conducted on this, and what we find is exactly what we would expect, that there is a gap between the successes of the children of slaves who became free versus the children of black people who were born free. And so that being said, the research also shows that
So there is even a difference, probably because they had a little bit, not opportunity, a little bit of a head start in terms of building generational wealth, right? They had extra time within their family lineage to go out and make money for themselves and then go ahead and pass that money on, whether it be through, again, literal inheritance or opportunities for schooling and education to their children. And, of course, educational opportunities and educational education in general leads to better outcomes for people, because if you're smarter and have better critical thinking abilities, you're more successful in whatever you try and do.
gaps between those people in terms of basic outcomes such as literacy, schooling, and occupational and economic mobility effectively disappeared within 2 generations. So within 2 generations, the descendants of slaves were not doing worse than the descendants of free blacks. Now,
right, because they were both, there was basically an artificial ceiling, because regardless of the fact that some came from slaves and some came from freed slaves, they were still black in America, and they were still facing at that point the same discrimination. It's not like they had a little name tag on that said, my family were freed. That's not how it works. You go into a bank, you say, I want a home loan. They go, no, you're black. It's 1946. Like, what do you think this is, John?
of course, they were still going to be doing worse than the average white person, but the point is that we can rule out slavery as the reason for that, since we were able to isolate it.
No, you can't, because slavery is a factor, but so is discrimination and Jim Crow. Don't act like when we say that black people have faced discrimination in the past and today, don't assume we're only ever talking about slavery. It's always a combination of things like slavery and Jim Crow, all that kind of stuff.
And find that whatever those effects may have been had disappeared within 2 generations. So if the effects were gone by the grandchildren of slaves, it is extraordinarily unlikely that they would be affecting current or future generations of black Americans. Now, that might seem counterintuitive, but it's actually pretty consistent with the way that things transfer between generations. In this particular case, wealth, not only in 19th century America, but in contemporary America as well. For example, we have research from broadly the same period of time that explores whether the descendants of those who won the Georgia land lotteries in the early 19th century did better in terms of income, wealth, and literacy rates. And for those unfamiliar, back in the early 1800s, there was a period of about 30 years where if you were a qualified citizen, you could register to win lots of land that formerly belonged to Creek and Cherokee Indians that were being lotteried for very low sales prices. And so what this research found is that there was no difference between the descendants of those who won versus those who did not in terms of wealth, literacy, or income. And so we also have data that looks at those whose wealth was destroyed during the Civil War due to slave emancipation and property destruction related to the war. And it shows that a person's wealth being destroyed by 10% predicted a 0.4% decrease in the income of their children. And by the next generation, it probably wouldn't be much more than 0%.
Okay, you're talking about 10%. They still have 90% of their wealth. That's a very specific asterisk, important point to point out. If I had 10% of my net worth destroyed, whatever that might be, I have a mortgage, so my net worth is in the negative. But, like, let's say, whatever. Let's say 10% of the value of my house were to go away tomorrow, and I do end up paying it off in the future. Will it suck? Yes, but that's something you can crawl back from. But if you start with literally nothing in a country where people hate you because of the color of your skin, that isn't a 10% difference in the amount of value you have on your property or wealth or whatever you want to call it. That's a huge systematic issue. That's not like, oh, 10% of my wealth was destroyed by the Yankees. How will I ever survive? Because the people that you're talking about are still plantation owners who still, even though they now have to pay for labor like normal human beings, now they have to still farm the land that they have. They just have to pay for labor. They still have their huge estate. They still have land. They still have the knowledge how to grow crops and have them, like, ready for selling, right? These are things that they still have. You're still talking about incredibly wealthy people who can crawl back up because they have the means to do so.
And it certainly wouldn't be greater than 0% 100 years later when those generations are being born. And so the point of this is that wealth doesn't just transfer in a constant state between generations. There's something of a half-life to it. It depends on the actions of the people at the time. This is why welfare has been a complete failure, why public education spending...
Welfare has been a complete failure. I disagree. But why welfare doesn't work is because it's been incredibly defunded. It's part of the Republicans' whole starve the beast strategy they've been doing since basically Ronald Reagan. They basically get into government just to dismantle its programs and then say, see, it doesn't work because they broke it. That doesn't mean it's a failure, John. It's doing its best. We need to expand it and make sure it's functional and stop Republicans from sabotaging the social safety nets that are so important for so many people.
Has been a complete failure because you can't just throw money at things and expect them to work. That assumes that the only problem is that they didn't have the money or the resources. Everything else was just the same. And that's not actually true. For whatever reason, money doesn't transfer between generations of black Americans as much as it does white Americans. And the obvious...
Because there's less wealth between generations of black Americans than there are white Americans. The more wealth you have, the easier it is to pass it on. Because a lot of your wealth, if you're, for instance, old and you don't have a ton of wealth, even if you've paid off your house... and you don't have the money to retire for whatever reason because you've had worse outcomes than white people in the same, like, let's say, socioeconomic bracket as you, or whatever, you haven't had the same opportunities, nonetheless, you might have to do something like get a reverse mortgage on your house, right? And then you're throwing away equity that could be passed on to your children, right? So after a certain point where you have a certain amount of wealth, everyone has sort of a cap, right? Everyone has a cap where, like, I have this much and now I can retire and the rest is all gravy that I can pass on to my kids if I want. But if you're not above that certain amount, then you're fucked because you have to dig into your net worth in order to retire, in order to take care of yourself in your old age, in order to deal with health issues, which affect black people more than white people, again, due to a variety of factors, including stress, and, again, poverty, which affects black people more than it does white people in this country. Like, there are a myriad of factors that explain this, John. Obowan with 100 bits. One thing John's still missing is that people were able to be denied home ownership through high-risk and high-priced loans until Chud happened in 2013. And Ask Compu says, LOL, owning a house and not just being stuck renting. That's funny. True. Well, not for me. I have a home loan, but still.
Obvious objection to this would be, well, black people can't save as much money for their children because they aren't making enough to even pay their bills because of racism.
Yes.
But that just isn't true. So just bear with me for a second. There's research that examines the levels of wealth between generations of different groups of people, and what it finds is that if you take the wealth of a white person's grandparents and you double it, then that will predict an 18% increase in the level of that person's wealth. But if you do the same thing with a black person's grandparents, then it will only predict a 2% increase in the level of that person's wealth.
Source? You're gonna need to source that.
At a 2% increase...
Let me see if there's a source on that one. Nope, no sources. What a shock.
This is not statistically significant, so it's possible that it's just a sampling error, and that the relationship with the general population
Psychotic
is actually
Dreamer
just that it
1,
has
thanks
no
for
effect.
following.
So in addition to that, we also have data that shows that black children who are born to parents in the top 20% of the income distribution are equally likely to end up in either the top 20% or the bottom 20% of the income distribution, whereas white children who are born to parents in the top 20% of the income distribution are much more likely to remain there than they are to end up in the bottom 20%.
And again, John isn't going to like this, but I would argue part of that has to do with Racial discrimination. I think white people have an easier time than black people do, regardless of their wealth. I think that's true. I gotta turn this air up. I'm dying. Ugh.
And so what this demonstrates is that wealth disappears so much within one generation of black Americans that the ideas that it can be stemmed back to slavery or even pre-civil rights era America are extremely unlikely and not very likely, respectively. And if that's not the case, then why is it that black Americans born to wealthy parents are equally likely to fall into the bottom 20% as they are to remain in the top 20%? The left will
Again, oh, he's gonna
say because of racism in other parts of their lives, and we'll get into those, but just keep in
I would argue that that's part of it. Yeah.
mind that they're going to want to hop from wealth to education to income to crime to everything because they don't
Because it's all interconnected. You can't pretend like these things exist in little cubes that don't touch each other.
want you to be able to corner them because their ideas won't survive that way. But the point is that this is not an indictment of black people. And this goes for the
It seems like it is, because, John, if you're saying that you believe that racism, socioeconomic factors, and how people get treated based on the color of their skin, whether it be for loans or businesses or whatever within this country, if you believe that the outcomes black people have in this country have nothing to do with that, then you are de facto saying that you think it just has to do with their race. It means that you think that a certain race of people are just bad. Bad at money, bad at getting ahead, bad at saving. And that's, like, fucked up to say. And I get that that's, like, not the most, oh, I'm logical, oh, much logic. But, like, what else do you want us to get out of this, dude? You're basically just trying to say, actually, black people have problems in America because they are black, not because of systematic racism. No.
the whole video. This is not me saying black people are in this position and it's their fault because XYZ. No, I don't feel as though it's my place to criticize black America, but what I will do is exonerate.
What? What are you talking about? It's like 40% of what your channel does.
White people from blame. I will tell you that these problems exist, but that they're not the fault of white people or the systems built by white people, and I will prove that to you, and I will highlight different decisions that are made by groups of people on average that are ultimately their responsibility and their prerogative. They are free to do these things, but again, this is not an indictment, but we can't pretend that decisions don't have consequences. And like I said, people are going to want to jump around with
This is not an indictment. Now let me spend the next 40 minutes explaining to you why everything that happens to black people in America is their own fault. Good disavowal.
wealth in particular, because there's so many different things that can contribute to it. So the slavery thing aside, what it really comes down to is saving and spending patterns when controlled for factors such as income. And what we find is that black people have lower savings rates than white people do on average, even when controlling for income. And if money isn't being transferred between generations, the implication of that is that it isn't being saved and it's instead being spent. And that's exactly what the research shows. And
You say that's what the research shows, but you don't link any sources, John. What the fuck are you talking about?
I'm going to read to you from an article written by a very bright young man named Coleman Hughes, with whom some of you may be familiar because he's written about this before. And I'll try to put something interesting up on screen to accompany this. But he wrote, quote, "No element of..."
Yeah, people are saying in the chat, poverty costs money. Yeah. If you're poor, then you can't save money, because it costs more money to be poor than it does to even be middle class, right? Do you know how much it costs, let's say, even if you're going to get a paycheck next week, let's say you go into the negative today at your bank account, right? You get a charge from a bill and you don't have the money. Every day, for instance, for my bank account, if I'm in the negative, it's a $30 charge. They charge you $30 a day per charge for not having money. Think about that, right?
Culture harms black wealth accrual more directly than spending patterns. Nielsen, one of the world's leading market research firms, keeps extensive data on American consumer behavior broken down.
Why is the background video that he's using for this from the VeggieTales movie Jonah? It's a weird choice.
demographically. A 2017 Nielsen report found that compared to white women, black women were 14% more likely to own a luxury vehicle, 16% more likely to purchase costume jewelry, and 9% more likely to purchase fine jewelry. A similar Nielsen report from 2013 found that while only 62% of all Americans owned a smartphone, 71% of blacks...
Why did you use costume jewelry as one of your things? Costume jewelry isn't, like, super expensive. I guess it depends on what you're buying. But the entire point is that costume jewelry is, like, not real diamonds and shit, right? It's like a way to look nice, but not be expensive.
Owned one. Moreover, all of these spending differences were unconditional on wealth and income. To what extent do poor spending habits explain the persistence of the wealth gap? Economists at the University of Chicago and the University of Pennsylvania asked this question after analyzing 16 years of nationally representative data from the Consumer Expenditure Survey. Consistent with the Nielsen data, they found that blacks with comparable incomes to whites spent 17% less on education and 32% more on visible goods, defined as cars, jewelry, and clothes. What's more, after controlling for visible spending, they concluded that the wealth gap between blacks and whites conditional on permanent income declines by 50%. To be clear, that 50% figure doesn't pertain to the total wealth gap, but to the proportion of the gap that remains after income is taken into account, which was 40%. The upshot? The fact that blacks spent more on cars, jewelry, and clothing explained fully 20% of the total racial wealth gap.
I would argue part of this has to do with the fact that, let's say my school, I grew up in a very white area. I think we had like 2 black kids in my entire class, right? We had classes that were like financial planning. We had classes that were like explaining how to use a checkbook and to save and how to invest in things and all that kind of stuff, right? I'd imagine those kind of programs that help teach people how to save is not as prevalent in, let's say, inner city schools where there's going to be a higher population of black students, right? The education in those schools is kind of bad on the whole, right? On top of that, I think that fiscal responsibility sort of comes partially, at least, from generational knowledge, right? Like, if my parents grow up with money, they're going to know how to save it and hold on to it, and they're going to impart those things onto me. However, if you are black in this country, there's a higher chance that you have less history of generational wealth, therefore your family is going to have less experience handling that wealth, therefore you might have a higher opportunity to spend it frivolously, let's say. That's how I would put it. Kitty Cat Nikki, thank you for subscribing.
Make matters worse, spending patterns are just one part of a larger set of financial skills on which blacks lag behind. Researchers at the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis followed over 40,000 families from 1989 to 2013, tracking their wealth accumulation and financial decisions. They developed a financial health scale ranging from 0 to 5 that measured the degree to which families made, quote...
Hold on, I gotta look this guy up. Someone in the chat saying, Coleman Hughes. Coleman Hughes is an American writer, opinion columnist on issues relating to race and racism at the online magazine Quillette, a fellow contributing editor at City Journal, and a host of the podcast Conversations with Coleman. Quillette is an online magazine by Australian journalist Claire Lehman. The magazine primarily focuses on science, technology, news, culture, and politics. It also publishes 2 podcasts, Wrong Speak, and the eponymous podcast Quillette. It's associated with the intellectual dark web. Quillette was originally created in 2015 to focus on scientific topics, but has come to focus on coverage of political and cultural issues, freedom of speech, and identity politics. Its editorial position was described in 2017 as libertarian-leaning. So he is citing sources from the, quote, intellectual dark web. Very reputable.
Routine financial health choices that contribute to wealth accumulation, like saving any amount of money, paying credit card bills on time, having a low debt-to-income ratio, etc. At 3.12, Asian families scored the highest, followed by whites at 3.11, Hispanics at 2.71, and blacks at 2.63. Next, they asked if education accounted for the differences in financial habits by limiting the comparison to middle-aged families with advanced degrees. Surprisingly, they found that the racial gap in financial health scores didn't shrink, it widened. Highly educated Asian families scored 3.49, comparable whites scored 3.38, comparable Hispanics scored 2.94, and comparable blacks remained far behind at 2.66. So that's all very interesting. And notice how Asians have better financial health scores than white people do. They also have a greater household income, a greater level of education, etc., etc. And these are things that the left doesn't want to talk about because they're...
We can talk about it. It's fine. I just don't think it's because they are Asian, John. I don't think there's something genetically that makes Asian people have higher incomes.
Narrative can't explain them. Other things that their narrative can't explain is why since...
Ask Compu with a bit. Why the fuck is he playing VeggieTales in the background? I have no idea. Oh, Hype Train, 94%. Nice.
The 1960s, in America, the black family structure has gotten worse. The income gap between white women and black women has gotten bigger, along with the income gap between black men and white men, along with the gap in wealth between white families and black families, the unemployment gap between white people and black people, and also that the poverty rate was decreasing until the 1960s when the war on poverty occurred, and then the poverty rate started to increase. Like, how did all of this happen as we were making progress? How did all of that happen while the New York Times was educating or indoctrinating us to do better? How did all of that happen while our country completely abolished racism within...
John, that's disingenuous. Do you think racism stopped when the Civil Rights Act was passed? That's not how anything works.
Institutions, and even granted privileges to non-white people, even while we had a black president. What about the difference in the rates of homeownership between decades being basically insignificant? What about that? The point is that if the effects of slavery and discrimination were the cause of these things, you'd expect them to diminish over time, but they haven't been, and in some cases
Again, because the underlying systematic issues haven't been dealt with, there are still tons of people in this country who either don't want to do business with black people or don't want to deal with them in general. People like you, John, and I know you're going to disavow that. But we both know how you feel about black people. So come on, you know that this is an issue. And also on top of that, I think we both know that you have the war bonds photo so you can have a swastika in your videos without getting banned.
They've even been getting worse. Now, this doesn't explain all of it. Remember, these are all very intertwined, but it does explain some of it. Breakdown of the family structure is also very significant to this. That's an entirely separate video, but...
Yeah, because those things have to do with the war on drugs, and that Nixon and Reagan intentionally changed policy in order to adversely affect, from Nixon's mouth, the hippies and the blacks, right? Black neighborhoods have been destroyed by the war on drugs. So many families have had, like, fathers taken away and put in jail for life for small amounts of weed. It's ridiculous. So, John, the question you were asking earlier about how did things get worse after, like, the 60s, even though we were getting better in the law, it's because we weren't actually getting better in the law. Some things got better, like the Civil Rights Act, and then, in response, conservatives did things like the war on drugs to specifically target black communities.
You'd be surprised at how much these gaps between white people and black people would disappear when you control for family structure. But anyways, now we'll get on to education. So the idea here is that black people don't have access to the same educational opportunities as white people.
Correct. And even when they do have educational opportunities, for instance, when we're talking about stuff like public school, inner city public schools, and again, inner cities have higher populations of African Americans, those schools are going to be underfunded because, unfortunately, for some batshit insane reason in this country, we fund schools using property taxes. So if you're in an area where the property is really, really cheap, like an inner city area, your school's not going to be funded as well as an area that's mostly white people that has like $1 million properties that have high property taxes. Pretty simple.
People, and this is partially why these disparities exist, such as
Arena's
income and
through with
eventually
500
wealth.
bits.
So it is thought.
Thank you.
How do we fix this according to the left? You guessed it. You throw money at it. You give black students special privileges. Has any of it worked? Evidently not. But
John, we haven't, again, dealt with the systematic issue. We need to stop funding schools in this country using property taxes. We need to make sure every school has a certain amount of funding, probably based upon student body size. Like how many students are actually there.
this is probably the most complex.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Between the six, and so we'll try to go through it piece by piece, but we do have to, of course, point out that there are gaps in education between groups of people. We know that Asian people complete more schooling on average than do white people.
Again, part of this reason is because a lot of the Asian population in the United States are first, second, or third generation immigrants, and if you're immigrating from another country, you're going to tend to have more money, because immigration to the United States, surprise, surprise, costs a decent bit of money.
and white people more than do Hispanic and black people. And we see the same pattern when we look at the average grade point averages of these groups. And so the left looks at this and they reasonably infer that it must be because minority students, particularly black students, must attend lower quality schools, which
they do.
Is why their performance is worse. How do they expect to improve the quality of the schools? Diversity initiatives aside, money is thought to play a large role. So the left often claims that black schools receive less funding than white schools. But before we look,
they literally do. John, I don't know what source you're about to pill out of your butt that's going to say otherwise, but it's like evidenced. This is true, John.
Look at this directly. We have to figure out if funding is even related to the quality of a school in the way that they think it is, as far as per pupil spending. There was a
Is he seriously going to be like, well, this school didn't get very much funding and it's real good? Nope.
Study done that analyzed the impact of test scores of 68.
School finance reform and the distribution of student achievement. School finance reform and the distribution of student achievement. Let's see where this is from. American Economic Association, American Economic Journal, Applied Economics, American Economic Journal. Let me see if there's just a Wikipedia, just to make sure it's a journal that's actually, like, reputable. The American Economic Journal is a group of 4 peer-reviewed academic journals published by the American Economic Association. So it is peer-reviewed. The names of the individual journals consist of the prefix American Economic Journal, descriptor of field attached. The 4 field journals, which started in 2009, are Applied Economics, Economic Policy, Macroeconomics, and Microeconomics. The American Economic Association set up an ad hoc committee on journals chaired by Robert Hall, which in April 2006, after 3-year study of the subject, recommended that the American Economic Association start 4 new field journals. Okay, so it's a peer-reviewed journal. Fair enough.
To changes in state-level school spending between 1990 and 2013, and it estimated that a $500 increase in spending led to a 0.09 standard deviation increase in test scores. And in statistics, the standard deviation is just how far the points are from the average of the data set, generally speaking. But we've also got data that looked at how variation in school funding because of the Great Recession impacted the performance of students, and it found that a 10% reduction in spending led to a 0.078 standard deviation decrease in test scores and a 2.6% decrease in the graduation rates. And then we've got data that analyzes the changes in school funding based off changing property values in 24 states.
See, I would argue that this is a little, how do I put this? This is going to be misleading, specifically because we're talking about a 10% decrease in funding caused by the Great Recession, which is something that affected everyone in the country. So, for instance, if you're a school that's in a white neighborhood that typically has, again, higher funding in the first place, and you reduce by 10%, it's probably not going to affect you as much if you're an inner-city school that reduces by 10% and you are already doing pretty bad, right? The school in the white neighborhood is still going to have the same teachers, probably, because the decrease in funding is due to a recession. So that's going to be across the board for all schools, right? So it's not like they're going to go to another school to try and find better pay because this is something that's affecting everyone in the nation. So you still have the same high-quality educators, the people who are going to flock to schools that pay them more in nicer areas, which are going to be predominantly white schools. The same teachers are just being paid less, right? So that's not really a check about... That's not really a check on our schools that get higher funding better than schools that are lower funding. It's literally saying, if this higher funded school loses some of its funding, do test scores go down? Yeah, a little bit. But even so, it's not going to be as much as the difference between the school with the higher funding and the school with the lower funding because these issues compound over time. So if you're a school that's typically had higher funding, you're going to have better facilities, more access to materials for the students. Even if you don't buy them that year, you'll have them from the past, probably more updated textbooks. If you're talking about schools nowadays, the higher funded school might already have, like, what are they called? Those Google Chromebooks or whatever that kids use at schools nowadays. You already have facilities, teachers, and equipment for the students that are going to facilitate their learning, whereas the lower funded school, which has never had these advantages, is not going to have those things for the students. So you would literally need to look at a study that's comparing 2 different schools. You can't just look at the same school from one year to the next if there's a 10% decrease, because they're still working with a lot of the same equipment, staff, and facilities that they had last year.
And it estimates that a 10% increase in spending leads to between a 0.05 and 0.09 standard deviation increase in test scores, and between a 2.1 and a 4.4% increase in the graduation rates. Then finally, data from 2015 that analyzes changes to school spending and estimated the relationships, which concluded that a 10% increase in per pupil spending each year for all 12 years of public school leads to 0.27 more completed years of education, 7.25% higher wages, and a 3.67 percentage point reduction in the annual incidence of adult poverty, and also that the effects are much more pronounced for children from low-income families. So we've got several analyses which utilize different data sets to suggest that school spending does have a moderate effect on test scores and future life outcomes. Now, from there, the left will say that black students have fewer resources allocated to their schools and that white schools are better funded. But what they're ignoring is that if you look at where the money actually goes within school districts, it is disproportionately given to black schools. There was a study done in 2017 that concluded that poor and minority students on average receive 1 to 2% more resources than non-poor and white students in the same district. So because whiter school districts get more funding, but whiter schools get less funding within school districts, we have to look at school level spending in order to get good numbers for per pupil spending. For that,
again, but we're talking about statistics here, so we're talking about on the whole schools in general. In certain districts, we're talking about in one district, you're going to tend to have schools that have the same racial makeup, right? There might be some areas where you have a school that's more a black school and more that where there's like a white school. But I would argue that probably even within the same districts, you're going to have the black school in an area where some, again, probably racist teachers don't want to go and teach. So you're going to have staffing issues. You're going to probably have facilities issues. These issues are still a problem, John, right?
there was a study done in 2008
and it also doesn't change the fact that on the whole, again, white schools with majority white students are going to be in areas with higher property taxes and are going to get funded more. You're talking about a very specific circumstance.
Calculated the spending per pupil in U.S. schools between 1972 and 2002, and it found that in 1972, the ratio of non-white to white spending was 0.98, and that this trend had reversed by 1982 because the spending per pupil for non-white students was slightly higher than for white students in most states and in the United States as a whole, and it's been this way for the past 20 years. And so since 1982, spending per pupil on non-white students has been greater on average than spending per pupil for white students. There was another study done on this in 2000.
In general, no, that's not the case.
2011 that affirmed this. They found that spending on black students was 1% greater than spending on white students, while
it's 1%, John. That's barely a difference.
Spending on Asian and Hispanic students was a few percentage points lower. Now, what the left likes to do is point to states where black students might be receiving 10% less funding than white students, but then they'll ignore or even celebrate other states in which black students are receiving like 18% more funding than white students. But the point is that if we're looking at the whole system on average,
again, you've provided no sources for any of this,
and we're trying to explain why these outcomes are so different on average when we're talking about national populations, then obviously the correct figure to reference would be the national average, which shows that spending doesn't actually systemically favor white students. If anything, it's actually leaning towards favoring black students. So
let's take a look, shall we? This would be easier to check if you actually cited your sources, John. School districts with the majority of students enrolled are students of color receive $23 billion less in education funding than predominantly white school districts, despite serving the same number of students, a dramatic discrepancy that underscores the depth of K-12 funding inequities in the United States. The top-line funding included a new report from EdBuild, a nonprofit that focuses on education funding, calls into question the ways state and local dollars are used to prop up some children at the expense of others, exposes a similarly startling funding discrepancy even when comparing poor white and poor non-white student districts. What we wanted to determine was, in a country where we are so fractured by race geographically, how does that play out with how much money on the how does that play out, and how much money on the whole do kids who are non-white receive versus kids who are white? Rebecca Silbia, CEO of EdBuild, says, education funding inequities have historically been debated, challenged, and litigated through the lens of income, status, and class, meaning that policymakers excuse me, meaning that policymakers have long sought to channel funds towards poorer areas with little regard to racial demographics in those neighborhoods. Today, at least 35 states actively work to redistribute education money to make up for the fact that wealthier school districts generate more local funding than school districts. But inequities in funding don't only occur based on poverty, as the Ed Build report reveals. Income is often a bad proxy for race, and despite attempts to distribute K-12 funding more equitably based on income, massive funding disparities still exist when examining the racial makeup of districts receiving it. We tested whether or not these funding formulas argued on the basis of class and funded on the basis of class have fixed a disparate problem in the country. What we found is, on the whole, we still have a major problem in how we're treating non-white communities, Sylvia says. More than half of all public school students in the U.S. are enrolled in a racially concentrated school district, defining in the report as one that's comprised of more than 75% white or non-white students. Researchers at EdBuild identified those school districts in each state and made 3 major funding comparisons based on the state and local K-12 dollars allocated to each. On average, poor non-white school districts receive 19%, or about $2,600 less per student, than affluent white school districts. This type of funding discrepancy is present in 21 states and is worse in some than others. In places like Arizona and Oklahoma, the difference in per-student funding is more than 30%. In Arizona, where poor non-white school districts receive 36% per student than in affluent white districts, that's a difference of more than $4,400 per student. For those who pay attention to K-12 funding, an issue increasingly became more mainstream as states experiment in ways to make their school funding systems more equitable. So this is saying the exact opposite. This is saying the exact opposite of what he's saying. What about this? A report finds $23 billion racial funding gap for schools. Overwhelmingly, white school districts receive $23 billion more than predominantly non-white school districts in state and local funding. So this is state and local funding in 2016, despite serving roughly the same number of children, a new report finds. Report released today. So, John, what are your sources? Because you're saying this without a source, right?
So another thing that's important for quality education is, of course, the size of the class, or the ratio of teachers to students. Seems like it would be pretty common sense, but there's also data that we can reference to sort of guide how we're thinking about this. So there's a meta-analysis that was done a few decades ago, but I still think that it's relevant because
Meta-analysis of research on class and
included over 75 papers, and I don't know that the relationship between teachers and pupils has really changed that drastically since then. Plus, it affirms what common sense would suggest along with what more recent papers suggest. But anyways, the point is that it found that students in smaller classes score significantly higher than students in larger classes, but once you get past about 20 kids, the effect is like basically inconsequential. So in other words, going from 8 kids to 20 kids has a much more significant effect than going from like 20 to 35 kids, if that makes sense. Like, it reaches a point where the additional divide in individually allocated attention doesn't even make a difference on the student. And then there was a study done in 2005 that drew data from over 1,000 effect sizes, and it produced an effect of 0.13, which is somewhat significant, but not exactly groundbreaking, even though this didn't have as many controls as it should have. But then there was another meta-analysis from 1989 with much better controls that produced the same effect size. So there's likely some merit to it as far as the empirical evidence that smaller classes increase student performance. And
I'd agree. I think that's true. Just from my own experience as a student back in high school, the classes where I had fewer other students, I definitely had a more one-on-one relationship with the teachers, and that allowed you to understand the topics better, especially like my AP classes, which had relatively small class sizes. I was able to talk with the teacher about things. A lot of the assignments were more like group discussion based, and that allowed for a more intimate understanding of the material, for lack of a better word.
And in addition to that, many states have launched programs to reduce class sizes, and they seem to have had some success. Analysis of these programs in Tennessee, for example, showed that being placed into a class or classes with fewer than 17 students predicted a 0.22 standard deviation increase in performance, and a follow-up of this program showed that the effects were still present 5 years later. And then something similar was done in Wisconsin with reducing class sizes to 15 students per teacher, and was found to increase performance by about 0.2 standard deviations within 5 years. So from this, we can infer that the size of the class does have some effect on the performance of the student, and from there we can also observe that the racial differences in class sizes in schools were effectively non-existent by the early 1970s, and even in the South by the late 1940s, I think, during segregation, the differences in class sizes were probably too small for that to have seriously mattered. And that doesn't mean that there weren't a host of other problems at that time. It just means that we can probably exclude the sizes of the classes from consideration. But class...
I don't know about that. I'd imagine in like an inner city school with less funding, they're going to have larger class sizes, because if you're going to have smaller class sizes with the same population of students, you're going to de facto need more teachers, and that always costs more money. The labor cost of the teacher is going to be high on the expense list for schools.
Size being a significant variable is sort of contingent upon teachers being competent, because if your teacher sucks, it doesn't really matter, how many kids are in the classroom. They're probably not going to be learning a whole lot. So the question then is, how do we classify a good teacher? Well, when we look at regression models with tons of controls for different metrics by which the competence of one as a teacher might be evaluated, we find that these different metrics don't seem to predict the future income of the students much at all. But these aren't that great because they usually control for educational attainment. And if your school sucks, your likelihood of going to college is going to be less, which could impact your future income. So looking at individual teachers isn't enough, but in studies that look at the relationship between school quality, earnings, and college choice in the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, and concerning the proportion of teachers at a high school with graduate degrees, they found that a 5.75 point increase in the proportion of highly educated teachers predicted a 1% increase in college attendance and a 0.25% increase in an individual's wages. And that's not exactly significant, but even if we assume that these characteristics of teachers do impact future successes, that still doesn't explain the left's narrative, because on average, blacker schools have more experienced teachers with more formal education and higher salaries. And even in the segregated South, the pay of black and white teachers equalized in the 1950s. So
the pay isn't necessarily going to directly equal to better teachers, right? People might be getting paid more because they don't want to teach in those districts. It's harder to get people to come and teach in those districts. For instance, Baja Blast. Baja Blast went to a school in Flint, Michigan, a area with a high African-American population. Her school had awful teachers, awful abusive teachers. She talks about this all the time, and about how one time a teacher literally threw down with a student and, beat them up. There are teachers who, even if the pay is higher, they're not going to want to go to schools like that, right? Pretty simple.
Given all that, the quality of teachers, at least in the way that we think, is unlikely to explain the differences that we're talking about. So from there, we can get into the types of classes that are being offered at the schools. That's, of course, going to impact the overall quality of the schools. And the narrative goes that one of the reasons that we see these differences is that black schools offer fewer classes than white schools. 71% of white Americans, 70% of Asian Americans, and 67% of Hispanic Americans attend high schools that offer Algebra 1 and 2, geometry, calculus, biology, chemistry, and physics, but these courses are only available for 57% of African Americans. Now, it's possible that taking these classes has an effect on future income. Sometimes you'll see studies that show...
I would think so. If you don't know algebra, there are a lot of jobs you can't do.
That taking these types of advanced classes in high school can impact your future earnings by as much as 7%. But the problem is that these studies don't take into account traits that might enable someone to do well in these types of classes, such as self-discipline and intelligence, which are both things that also lead to a higher income. So
is he saying that black people are too stupid to do algebra? Because it sounds like that's what he's saying. That's, fucking ridiculous to say. And algebra is not complicated. Algebra is, basic math. X plus 6 equals 9. Find X. Algebra is not complicated. That's, basic math you should know in order to live your life, right?
This creates a false correlation. I'm not a disciplined genius because I took a dozen AP classes, but instead I took them because of that, because big brain. It is not the big that decides the...
John, do you not understand that in order to succeed in things like AP classes, which I also took, you're going to need a foundation in order to get into and succeed in those classes? So, John, if you don't have an algebra class to go to in earlier years in your, middle or high school career, then how are you going to take, AP calculus in high school? You need prerequisites in order to understand these things. You don't get smart just because you're smart, right? You can be smart and be incredibly uneducated. If you're smart, that's great, but you're smart because you've been able to have the opportunity to learn a lot of things. You're not smart just because.
The brain, but rather the brain that decides the big. That is the most insightful thing I've ever said. But that aside, looking at AP classes, there's no obvious relationship between how black a school is and how likely they are to offer AP level classes. And since the 1990s, the schools that have been the least likely to offer AP classes have all been the whitest schools. And there's a few state level analyses that support this. Like in Florida, Black and Hispanic students are about as likely as white students to attend schools that offer AP classes, and the same seems to be the case in like Texas and California, with only a slight difference, etc. So in general, there doesn't seem to be any merit to this idea that Black students don't have access to AP classes. And also, Black students...
Okay, but even if they have access to AP classes, you already cited a study earlier that shows that Black schools are going to be less likely to offer things like Algebra 1. Like, if you don't take classes like that are the basic foundation of so many things, like mathematics, higher level mathematics, or if we're talking about like AP World History, which is a class that I took, you need a decent understanding of like civics and like geography and sort of like United States history in general, at least for some of it. Like, you need these things as prerequisites to succeed at taking the AP classes. Otherwise, you have that much more work to do once you get into the class. Just because a school is offering those classes doesn't mean they have offered the prerequisites to allow people to succeed in those courses.
This is also making me so fucking mad. So, what about when the conditions in the classroom are not conducive to being able to learn and succeed? So, like, where I grew up, the high school didn't have air conditioning in the building at all. And during the winter, only half the building had heat. So, all of the kids, which at that point, because they had closed so many of the schools in the district, it was K through 12 in what was originally supposed to be just a high school. So all of the kids had to squish into the half of the building that had heat, because the other half didn't have heat and the windows were fucking broken. How can you work and succeed in AP classes or in any classes if you have to try and work under those conditions? It doesn't make any sense. Like, this, whatever studies he's citing, or whatever pieces of studies he's like picking apart to support his narrative, it's obviously not taking into account a lot of things. Where I grew up, I was one of maybe 2 white kids in some of my classes. It was mostly Black kids. It was an area with extreme poverty. It was Flint. The whole water crisis thing happened. And now it's going to be even harder for those kids, because a lot of them were exposed to lead, and they're going to have, learning difficulties because of that. And they already didn't have enough money. They've already closed the majority of the schools in the district for a city of 100,000 people. And like, they don't have the teachers that are trained for what the kids need. It makes me so upset and so mad thinking about, where I grew up, the schools that I grew up in, the teachers that I interacted with, and him just trashing on it and saying that you just need to fucking pull yourselves up by your bootstraps and you're getting the same opportunities, so quit whining about it. That's not the case. It's not the case at all. It was a school of impoverished children who had shit home lives. We had teachers that out of their own pocket would buy us notebooks because we didn't have money to buy notebooks, and we didn't have textbooks. We all had to share like a few amount of textbooks. We had to keep our notebooks in class locked in a cabinet so that we couldn't lose them, or we wouldn't have a notebook to take notes. So you're not getting a lot of kids don't have parents that would be able to help them with their homework for one reason or another. They're working like 3 jobs. And so it's like a compounding effect. If you're poor, if you're hungry, if you're going to school and you have security guards outside of every single classroom, if you have to get fucking patted down, metal detected every single morning when you get to school, you're waking up super early, earlier than most kids, because you have to get to school an hour early so that you can actually go through the metal detectors, because they treat you like you're in a fucking prison. Like, it's fucking trash. Like, the kids aren't getting what they need. And that's just how it is.
Yeah. John's trash.
Students make up about 9% of the students who
Also,
take AP
fuck
exams.
him. He says he's from Detroit. He's from the rich-ass suburbs in Detroit. So fuck you, John.
Yeah, she knows John's address.
Every year, but they only make up about 4% of the students who pass an AP exam. And among black students who take an exam, only 26%
True, his parents are. He lives at his parents' house.
receive a qualifying score. For those unfamiliar, you have to score at least a 3 to pass an AP exam, and they're scored out of 5. So for white students, the average score is 2.97, which suggests, broadly speaking, that white students are taking the right amount of AP classes, because if you restricted that to like a smaller number of students who scored higher, like a 4 or higher, then you'd be excluding students who were qualified and who would have passed the exam with like a 3. But for black students, the average score is a 1.91, which suggests that more black students are attempting AP exams than are qualified to pass them. So not only is it that there's no real difference between class offerings, but also that more black students are taking AP exams than should be, just based on scores. And a lot
Again, because they're in worse off situations and underfunded schools in worse situations. So even if they have the same class, they might have a shitty teacher who's not qualified to teach that subject. They might have a myriad of issues like Baja Blast was discussing in terms of equipment, not having the textbooks to be able to take home and study like you should for an AP class, not even being able to take notes correctly because you have to give notebooks back and locked away. Like, you need to study for AP classes to get it to work, to be able to take the test and succeed, right? Like, John, what do you not understand about the fact that most black schools in this country are underfunded? I know you said they're not, but you provided no source, so it kind of sounds like you're just pulling it out of your asshole.
of that has to do with the differences in the amount of time spent studying or doing homework, which we're about to get into. But the point is that given this information, and given that class offerings haven't been shown to causally impact success, and the fact that differences in offerings aren't that significant, the idea that differences in general education levels or future income can be explained by this really doesn't have much merit to it, and certainly not if it's being blamed on racism. But another very important factor in the quality of education, and arguably one of the most important factors, is how the students behave in school. Are they focused on learning? Are they disruptive, etc.? And by the way, anecdotal, but teachers working in these inner city schools have reached out to me to tell me that this all stems from the home. Parents don't discipline their kids, and then the parents want to blame the schools, and they want to blame the teachers, which in our case would be the same.
What teachers from any inner city schools do you know, John? I would imagine pretty fucked up right-wing racist ones, considering they know you well enough to send you a message. No offense, but that's a bit of a bias, right? The teachers who are writing to you and telling you that are the kind of people who would watch your show, and the kind of people who would watch your show unironically and without, like, trying to debunk it are shitbags. Sorry. That's, I guess, anecdotal, but so's what you're saying, so guess we're even.
System, it's ridiculous. But anyways, for some reason, it is the case that black and Hispanic students spend less time on homework than white students, and white students spend less time than Asian students. This is true despite the fact that...
Again, this probably have... Oh, thank you to Chair Dickinson for following. This probably has to do with the fact that, again, within poorer households, they have less help getting their homework done.
Black and Hispanic students are more likely than white and Asian students to have parents who check to see that their homework is completed. And please spare me the, well, it's because they have to spend time working to support their families. No, it isn't.
That's not what I said. I think their parents probably have to spend more time working multiple jobs in order to support the family. Therefore, there's less people at home to keep the kids accountable in order to make sure they do their homework. That's probably a factor.
2018, among youth enrolled in high school, white students were the most likely to be employed at 22%, followed by black and Hispanic students at 14%, and Asian students at 11% because of that Asian privilege of theirs. And in addition to that, black and Hispanic students tend to misbehave more while in school as early as preschool, as the LA Times reports. The Civil Rights Data Collection, a national survey conducted by the U.S. Department of Education...
Yes, and I'm sure black kids getting suspended more often has nothing to do with racism. Even if you think that's not the case, John, because I know you don't. I understand that. Do you not think that a myriad of factors go into why children misbehave at school? Do you not think that their upbringing, do you not think that growing up in a family with a single parent, which is more likely if you are African American in this country, again, I would argue due to things like the war on drugs, do you not think that that's going to be associated with worse outcomes for children and their behavior?
Gathered information on more than 50 million students at more than 95,000 schools. The survey included about 1.5 million preschool students in about 30,000 schools. They found that black preschool children overall were 3.6 times as...
You can't tell if he's disingenuous or being this dumb, or he's really this dumb. He's disingenuous. John is disingenuous.
...likely to be suspended as white
He knows what he's doing.
Preschoolers, and then research from there shows that these gaps in suspension rates persist as kids grow older and remain even after controlling for socioeconomic status. But that aside, and this is interesting, those gaps disappear when comparing people with the same previous histories of behavioral problems or when comparing people who were both sent to the principal's office for the same reason. And that suggests that racial differences in suspension and expulsion rates are due to differences in behavior rather than bias and rule enforcement by racist faculty. Also important.
Again, the reason that kids can act up is probably due to home life stuff. That's usually why kids act up.
Important to note, there are differences between groups of students in bullying behavior. We find that black students...
I just want to point out, too, and I know this is obvious, but I feel it's worth pointing out, John's conclusion here, saying without saying it, because of course he's not going to say it out loud, because if he did, his channel would get banned, rightfully so. But his implication here is, well, black people just misbehave. They commit crime. Black people are unruly. Like, this is the implication he's making here, right? Everyone sees that? Just want to make sure we're on the same page. This guy's a piece of fucking shit.
Students are more likely to be bullies than are white students, while white students are more likely than black students to be the victims of bullying, and Hispanic students are more likely than black students to be engaged in bullying, but also more likely than black students to be a victim of bullying. And also that racial differences in family, socioeconomic status, neighborhood socioeconomic status, attachment to friends, parents, school, and physical development don't explain these differences in bullying. Also important to note...
You can't just say that. What do you mean they don't explain it? Did they control for that? Do you have a link to that study? No. Oh, what's the point of providing sources on screen if you don't actually allow other people to go and look at those sources, John? It's almost like you're being disingenuous. What a shock.
Black on white bullying is 64% more common than is white on black bullying, which isn't exactly what you would expect in a racist, white supremacist school system. And part of what causes these differences is that bullying is socially...
Does he realize that you can be a bully and a victim of bullying at the same time? I don't know. I don't know what John's thinking.
Rewarded in these student subcultures. We find that after controlling for gender, age, academic performance, family structure, parental educational attainment, and extracurricular activities, the more non-white students bully others, the more popular they are among their peers. And for whatever reason, this effect is...
That sure is a chart. Where are you getting this chart from, John? Still no links? Just checking.
Does not exist among white students. This is a very sad and unfortunate reality, and don't you dare for a second pretend that it's not true, because black kids get bullied by other black kids for acting white if they resist these types of subcultures. And if you don't believe me, it's probably because you're one of these white liberals whose high school was like 98% white. But considering things like in-class behavior, study habits, etc., seem to be much more realistic than just screaming racism, you know? And this is why school choice would be great.
John, I'd imagine, considering you're from a wealthy suburb of Detroit, you also went to a mostly white school. So what the fuck are you talking about?
Because there's no reason that a black student should have to stay in an environment where he's bullied for acting white by intently focusing on his classes. So after all that, we've seen that there's actually a pro-black bias in terms of overall spending, class size, teacher quality. There might be a pro-white bias in terms of the classes that are offered, but again, there's no evidence that really shows that this is true. And even if it is, it can't really account for more than a tiny proportion of income differences, assuming that they even have an effect at all, which again, as we've already talked about, is questionable. So on the net, it actually seems that there's something of a pro-black bias in American high schools.
Oh, God.
And the same is true in our university system, and this is easier to show. Once qualifications are controlled for, black applicants are roughly 20 times more likely than white applicants to be admitted to a university, law school.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So my parents, they grew up in like a small town, and so they went to high school in a small town. Like, my dad, he grew up in Flint and then went to high school at a town that was like 35 minutes away, and it was so small that it wasn't even a town. It was just a village. It had like just a small amount of people, and that's where my mom went to. My parents decided when my brother and I got older, they didn't want us to go to high school in Flint because of the experiences that my dad had had. When we moved back to this small town that my parents had gone to high school in, let me tell you, it was probably the most horrifying thing to ever happen to me. Like, just think about all of the stories that I've told you about my time in Flint and growing up there and going to school there. The moving to this 99% white school, small town, everybody's a farmer, nobody's met a black person, like, none of that. It was awful. Everybody was racist, everybody was Christian, everybody was homophobic. Like, if you think about just, like, all of the kids that I grew up with in Flint, they were more well-rounded, more dedicated, and nicer than the majority of the kids that I ended up going to high school with. Just because these kids, they have so much on their shoulders. When you're growing up poor and when you're growing up in a system that won't take care of you, when you're growing up with parents that won't, can't provide for you, or they're trying their best and they're working 4 jobs, they can't spend the time with you because they're just trying to put food on the table. Like, I remember when one of my classmates, he got killed at a bus stop. He was, shot in a drive-by shooting. And that day when we were all in class, like, I remember that feeling of all of us just had this weight on our shoulders that none of the kids I went to high school with would ever have. Oh God, I'm getting emotional. Like, not having food and not having people to turn to. Like, we didn't have school counselors. A lot of the kids, they couldn't afford to go to the doctor if they were sick. Like, you just have this weight that people won't understand, and John will never understand. That, like, you can't be a kid. And how are you supposed to learn in that kind of environment? Especially with teachers that don't have faith in you. A lot of teachers, I'm not saying all the teachers, I did have some really, really amazing teachers that I'm actually, like, still friends with, that, like, treated us like we were their kids. But a lot of the teachers, they just want to go and teach in these places, these inner city schools, because they get their student loans forgiven. And I think that that's a great way of getting teachers in, but they're not there because they want to work with kids that, have these problems. They're not there because they want to be able to help and to be able to deal with it. And a lot of them aren't equipped because their education wasn't, didn't give them the tools to help kids that are, like, emotionally, just emotionally troubled or whatever. And it makes me so mad because John is just, like, the worst kind. He's the worst kind of person. I did have one really great teacher in high school, and I took a sociology class with him, and I was, like, the only fucking reasonable person in this class because I understood. Like, I had come from being poor, and, like, I still was poor, and I got it. Like, I wasn't a racist piece of trash like a lot of these kids were. And my teacher was like, I wish that everybody could have the experience that you had, where you see, like, both sides of the coin. Because I went from an inner city majority like, black school to a majority white school, and I got to, like, pull my experiences from that and not turn into a shit-ass person. And, you know, everybody in high school is awful, but, like, I don't know. He just makes me so mad because he reminds me of, he just reminds me of the kids that I went to high school with. And that's because he probably is exactly like the kids I went to high school with. He's never had to want for anything. He's gotten literally everything he's ever wanted. And he just doesn't have those experiences. He didn't get to see firsthand how, like, we were treated. We were literally treated like we were criminals. Like, my middle school treated us like we were in a prison. Like, we weren't allowed to get up and go use the bathroom. We were 99% of that year, we were on lockdown. So we couldn't leave class for any reason. It didn't matter. A kid in my class, like, couldn't make it to the bathroom. He peed his pants in middle school because we weren't allowed to leave class. And, like, obviously this is just anecdotal. This is just my experience. And just, I don't know. Like, I don't know what to say to him beyond, like, he's a fucking kid who's always gotten everything he's ever wanted. And he's looking at studies and he doesn't understand whether or not the studies are good studies. Whether or not they take into account the amount of variables that they should be. Like, what are these kids going through? What are their home lives like? And yeah, maybe they are fucking acting up because they don't have someone at home to pay attention to them.
The tools of capitalism.
Maybe they are taking care of all of their siblings. Maybe they're the ones that work so that they can put food on the table. Maybe they, you know, have mental health problems that aren't being taken care of because they don't have enough money to go to the doctor. Like, I don't know. I don't know what to say anymore.
It makes you feel better. John knows this is all bullshit. He's just a fascist and an ethno-nationalist, so he knows. Okay, just letting you know.
Doesn't make me feel better.
Like, he doesn't believe any of this shit. He just wants to use it to demonize black people.
That's the problem. That's the thing that I don't like. He believes it in the sense that he wants to demonize black people.
Mm-hmm.
That's the part that's awful.
Yeah.
Like, if you grow up in a society, even if, you know, everything was perfect right now, even if white people and black people had the same amount of money and all the schools were the same or whatever, if there was still just racism, just that one variable, it would still have an impact on how black kids are doing in school. If you grow up in a world that sees you as less than human, like fucking John thinks black kids are, then you're already being taught this. You're being taught that you're less than human. You're being taught that you're stupider. You're being taught that you're, like, not as good, that you can't do these things. It already has an impact. There was a study, I don't have the citation, but there was a study that says if you say to someone before they take an exam that they're not going to do well, or if they say to themselves they're not going to do well, they do 10% less than if somebody is told you're going to do fine. You're going to do good before the exam. If you grow up if you grow up being told that you're less than, you're gonna think that. And then add all of the rest of the variables. How, a lot of majority black cities are impoverished because fucking racist bullshit. It's just, I can't, I don't have the words. I
school or medical school, and Hispanic Americans are 3 times as likely to be accepted. And specifically in selective colleges, it's been estimated that the proportion of students who are white would increase from 66 to 75% if admissions were based solely on test scores. Plus, once actually...
Yes, again, they're trying to correct for biases that have already existed in the system. That's the entire point, John.
In college, minority students are more likely to receive aid in paying for their education. They account for 38% of the student population and 40.4% of grant funding, while white...
They're trying to give opportunity to people who normally wouldn't get it to try and offset the fact that education for black students in America, for all the reasons that Baha and other people have talked about, it's unfortunate, but they're trying to compensate for that, so moving forward, those people who are able to get a higher education can then have children who have more opportunities than the parents had, and then hopefully over time this equality of opportunity can be met, which it is not right now.
Students account for 61.8% of all students and 59.3% of grant funding. So it's not a huge difference, but it's still a difference. And if it were reversed, we'd definitely be talking about it. So there's that. But there's also a slight trend of white students being more likely than black students to be employed while in college, and Asian students being the least likely to be employed, Asian privilege, which leads into the fact that black, Hispanic, and white students have similar chances.
Again, John, this has to do with the fact that Asian students are going to be more likely to be immigrants, whether first generation, second generation, whatever, and people who are immigrants from other countries legally are going to tend to have more money. So if your parents have more money, there's a higher likelihood they're not going to make you get a job during college to pay for your own expenses. It's pretty simple. Would you heat up that turkey thing I have in the freezer? It's like a smart one or a lean cuisine or whatever. Thank you. Haven't eaten today. I'm very hungry.
Of their parents paying for a significant proportion of their college education, whereas Asian students are more likely than others to have that parental aid because Asian privilege. So it turns out that there's actually...
If you're talking about children of immigrants who are going to be richer, yes. You can't say Asian privilege. In this case, we're talking about Asian immigrants with wealthy parents, specifically, not all Asians, right? Yes, that would be a privilege, just like you have a privilege, John, just like I have a privilege in many ways.
Actually a strong anti-white bias in college admissions and just a slight anti-white bias in college funding, which is contrary to the narrative of systemic racism in education against black students in favor of...
No, because usually when people are talking about stuff like that, they're talking about the public education system. In K through 12, they're not usually talking about colleges. Colleges are often pretty good at trying to correct for those biases that are present in the K through 12 system. So we have things like affirmative action, which are good, John. I know that triggers you, but it happens to be true because it gives opportunities to people who normally wouldn't due to the way they were raised or due to the fact that they are a certain skin color or due to the fact that they were in a school system that didn't treat them very well, so they're going to have lower test scores. It gives them better opportunities so they can succeed in life and then give their children even greater opportunity, right? That's the entire point.
White students. But the most interesting thing in my opinion is that when you control for all factors so that the only difference between people is the color of their skin, black...
You literally cannot control for all factors in something as complicated as this. You can do your best, but at the end of the day, you're never going to be able to control for all the factors. You're just not. There are too many factors that go into being black in America and the disadvantages that go with it, and going to these inner city schools that you cannot control for them. You just can't.
Black Americans actually have higher educational attainment than do white Americans. And
cool.
you might remember that in the beginning we talked about the differences in the averages between groups, but if you control for the relevant factors according to the data from the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, black students actually achieve more education than white students, which is exactly what we'd expect if our education system had...
Again, you're talking about controlling for stuff like income because, again, we're giving more opportunity to people who are black, who have lower incomes and come from schools where they probably tested worse, right? because we're trying to compensate for the fact that the white students already probably came from a place. And again, I'm saying probably. I'm not saying this system has never fucked anyone white over, but the fact is, on the whole, we're trying to compensate for the fact that there's already this disparity in the system, and in doing so, we're trying to bring that equality of opportunity on the whole, again, we're talking about on average, up to parity between the races.
A pro-black bias, which, as we've just discussed, it clearly does. So that's education, but from there we can get into loans. The argument here is that racial differences in the ability to acquire a loan are evidence of anti-black racism or white privilege, and they're said to lead to disparities in the rates of home ownership, which then have their own range.
In the past, more than there is today, I'd imagine. I imagine it still happens, but again, this is more prevalent in the past, which affects people today. Again, people like John seem to pretend that we all live in a little box and that history is in the past and completely separate. But if your parents didn't get a loan to go to college because of discriminatory loan practices, or their parents, you are going to be less likely to go to school yourself because your parents probably don't make as much money and are going to be less able to afford for you to go to school yourself, or to be able to have the opportunity to get these loans without it being a huge burden on yourself, right? So, yeah. John, history's connected to what we do today.
Range of long-term socioeconomic consequences. So looking at data from Pew Research, we can see that it's true that black people are indeed more likely to be denied for a mortgage loan, but even amongst blacks...
Okay, that's a pretty big deal, John. You gonna glaze over that? Like, you didn't even just say that that's a thing? You don't think that's gonna affect people in their future if they're unable to start building equity in a home? Like... I know you don't own a home, John. You don't even rent an apartment. You live with your parents, so I get that you don't understand this. But, like, I'm a homeowner, right? So what happens is every month with my mortgage, I take the money I make from making fun of dickbags like you, and I pay it into my mortgage. Over a 30-year period, I'm going to be able to pay off my mortgage instead of throwing away that money on rent every month. Because when you pay for rent, that money's gone. You get nothing in return other than the fact that you get to stay under that roof for that month, right? But when I pay my mortgage payment, I'm building equity in my home. What that means is basically I own more and more of my home every month, and by the end of my mortgage period, I am going to own a house, which is an asset that I can then sell for money. And ideally, we've seen this in the history of the U.S. housing market, housing prices have tended to go up. Of course, we have crashes. Look at the 2008 housing crisis and what's probably going to happen in another 10 to 15 years for that. But it's an investment, right? I'm probably going to get a return on investment, or at minimum going to get what I put into it out of my house at some point in the future. And that's a cool thing, and that's great. But if you don't have that, then you are systematically disadvantaged, whether you're white, black, Asian, Hispanic, whatever, specifically because there's a huge chunk of your income every month that's literally getting set on fire, figuratively, not literally, being set on fire by handing it over to a landlord, right? So why bring this up if it goes against the entirety of what you're saying? Very interesting.
The rate of denial is like 27%. And assuming that's because of racism, like practically speaking, it isn't that racist. Like it could be worse. Let's be that's because of racism. Like,
what an argument. It's not that racist. It's only 17% higher than white people, or 15% higher than everyone else. It could be worse. Really? That's your fucking argument? Genius.
Even amongst blacks, the rate of denial is like 27%. And assuming that's because of racism, like practically speaking, it isn't that racist. Like it could be worse.
Someone clip that shit. Fuck this guy.
Let's be glasses half full, right? That's a joke. But you get the point. Like if racism in the loans...
That's a joke. What's the humor there, John? What's the joke other than you don't think it matters that people are discriminated against for home loans based on the color of their skin? What's the humor? Like, what's the joke? I'd love to know what the joke is there, John, you fucking idiot.
System, we're really contributing to so much of the hardship that black Americans face. You'd expect it to be more than 27% racist. But that being said, it's also true that...
It's only a 17% difference, guys. 17%'s basically nothing. By the way, did I mention white schools have a 1% difference in there? John, Bud... Please stop.
Tools of capitalism.
Chief Tony, thanks for subscribing.
Black people are more than twice as likely as white people to get a mortgage interest rate of 8% or more, but this is actually very rare even amongst black holders. Like if you look at the average interest rates.
Okay, but it's still more, John. We're talking about the difference, right?
Between white, Hispanic, and black people, they're actually pretty similar, but Asians tend to be a bit lower because of that Asian privilege, of course. But
again, John, most Asian people in this country, because again, Asian people, while there was certainly like really bad labor conditions and forced labor in like, let's say the west coast of the country when building the railroads, there wasn't really Asian chattel slavery in this country. So if you are Asian in this country, then you are probably coming from someone or some family that immigrated legally, right? And in order to immigrate to the United States legally, you have to have a bunch of money and a skill set that's going to get you approved. So you're probably coming from a family with money in the first place, and this ties back into the idea of generational wealth and how it helps you moving forward as an individual even though you didn't build that wealth yourself. That's part of it. So yes, you're right. If your parents are wealthy, if their parents were wealthy, you have a privilege because you're benefiting from that. Same as you, John, you're benefiting from the fact that you live at your parents' house and you get to use it as a free studio for your shitty YouTube channel, right? That's a privilege. I'm not telling you to feel bad about that, but it describes what is happening.
Even then, we can't necessarily infer from that a racial bias against black people because, as we talked about, black people and white people don't have the same behaviors with money.
Oh, God. Hold on. Thank you to AskCompU with a bit, with some kind of something. Yeah, same energy, this thing. Very funny.
There was another study done on this that examined data on over 25,000 American households, and it found that the homes of black Americans had lower rates of saving money than the homes of white Americans.
Again, I would say this ties into a myriad of factors, one of which being if you're a family that has generational wealth or a family that has had wealth for a relatively longer period of time, people in your family are more likely to have better spending habits because they've been taught by their predecessors how to handle their money. For instance, I was fortunate in the sense that my mom, who I don't talk to anymore for a variety of reasons, but either way, she was a banker, right? My family grew up in a relatively middle-class place. Both my parents grew up in middle class to upper middle class. My dad more middle class, my mom more upper middle class. Her dad made a decent bit of money, still does, on like investments and stuff. So from those people, I saw what responsible spending and investing looked like. On top of that, my mom was also a banker, so she had me invest in like a Roth IRA from a very young age from the time I got my first job, and I ended up using the money from the Roth IRA that I had in order to put the down payment on this house. So it's really great. But I wouldn't have learned those things and wouldn't have learned how to spend my money responsibly if it weren't for those people. Okay? Pretty simple.
Even after controlling for differences in income, age, family size, education.
Thank you so much.
Something else that I wanted to say, growing up poor like I did, it's very, I don't even know the word to say it, but John, he has never wanted for anything, so he probably doesn't understand what it's like to be poor. If you, let's say, have been struggling to get food on the table, and you finally, I don't know, get your tax return, and you have like a good chunk of money, are you gonna go out and use that money to invest? Are you gonna put that money in fucking stocks? No, you're gonna use that money to pay off all of your bills and to buy your kids something, probably. Like, they don't ever get new things, so you really want to get your kids like a new coat because you have this money.
Or shoes.
Or shoes. Like, you're not thinking about, okay, what's the best way I can turn this money into more money? You're thinking about your kids who hardly ever get anything, right? And that's what's frustrating. Of course, people aren't able to save when they're living paycheck to paycheck. Like, it's like all those people are like, oh, if you didn't buy that video game, or if you didn't buy that new refrigerator, or you didn't buy that PlayStation for your kid, like, that's not the problem. The problem isn't that people are using the small amount of money that they have to buy a PlayStation that's like 3 years old or whatever from a pawn shop, so it's real cheap relative to what it would be if it was new. That's not the problem. The problem is that they don't have what they need, right? Like, if you're going through life and your kids don't get any of the normal things that kids of rich families or middle class families get, you want to give them something so that they can have just a little taste of things that other kids have. You want to get them that PlayStation. You're not going to save that money and put it into a stock portfolio. And I don't know how to explain that to someone that has never had to deal with this.
There's nothing funny.
I just don't know how to do it.
New Monster, thanks for continuing your subscription.
And marital status, all the relevant variables at which banks and lenders would be looking. And this could be why black people and white people with equal incomes don't have the same credit scores. Even 20 years ago, the Washington Post would publish articles citing studies that found that white Americans
Mm-hmm. You take this. Thank you.
Americans earning less than $25,000 a year had better credit records as a group than black Americans earning between $65,000 and $75,000 a year, and that overall 48% of black Americans and 27% of white Americans had bad credit as defined by Freddie Mac in the study. But that being said, the left will sometimes claim that racial differences in loan acceptance rates remain even after taking differences in credit into account. And that is true. But it's also true that credit scores aren't equally accurate for black and white Americans. There was a report submitted to Congress by the Federal Reserve on how well loan performance is predicted by credit scores, and it said that across all 3 credit scores and all 5 performance measures, black Americans show consistently higher incidences of bad performance than would be predicted by their credit scores. So,
And again, I know you're not going to like this, John, but again, I think this has to do with at least partially racism in the country, where people who are black, if they lose their job suddenly, are going to have a harder time to find a new one. So if you lose your job, have a harder time finding a new one, you're going to slip on some of your bills. And not only that, but again, the stuff I was talking about in terms of generational saving and knowing how to deal with credit and knowing how to pay off things responsibly, these are things that are learned. These aren't innate traits in people.
in other words, if you loan money to a white man and a black man with equal credit scores for whatever reason, the white man is far more likely to give you your money back. And because of things like this, the typical attempts to control racial differences in loan risk aren't sufficient for what we're trying to find, which is clear evidence of racial bias against minorities, specifically...
I didn't see the link. Hold on. Let me find it. I gotta go... Oh god, how far back is it? Class of 15, 20, 25, 30, 40, and 45 students. When you see it, you'll understand why it matters.
20 students, still good. 25, this is still manageable. All right, 30 students, it is getting a little overwhelming at this point. All right, 35 students, we don't have enough seats. We're at 40 students right now. It's getting a little cramped. This is 45 students. I'm afraid we get jumped any minute. All right? So 45 students. 15, this is...
Basically talking about how being cramped in a room with a bunch of other people is not an ideal circumstance for learning.
Black Americans, and more specifically, not ever Asians, right? But we do actually have some evidence to suggest that racial bias doesn't exist. For example, a study done in 2019 that analyzed a data set consisting of all FHA-insured mortgages that originated in 2014 and 2015, and it found that after controlling for lender effects, credit scores, and income, the interest rate gap between black people and white people was only 0.03%, and the gap between white people and Hispanic people was about half of that. So not exactly a significant gap. I mean, we're talking about 0.03%. And the study also included data on discount points.
So what's that difference from, John? if it's not racial bias. And I don't want to hear, oh, it's a little minuscule. Okay, it's still a percent. And I don't think you're probably controlling for everything correctly. You also, again, haven't cited your sources. So, you can't just cite stuff and then act like it's fine if you don't provide the links.
Which actually revealed a racial difference in favor of non-white people, and upon combining this data into a single model, they found no racial bias in the expected pay schedule of the person borrowing. And in addition to that, they found that the expected revenue to be generated by a loan did not significantly differ by the race of the borrower. And this is pretty hard to explain within the context of the left's narrative, because we know that once other differences are controlled for, different races of borrowers experience the same expected pay schedules, which is what you would expect if there were no racial bias. And the fact that the expected revenue from the loans didn't differ between the races of borrowers means that the lenders were very likely just accurately predicting the terms which would maximize the profit from the loan in each case.
Okay, but John, the fact is, black people in this country are starting out with worse outcomes in the first place. So how are they going to get ahead, even though we're like 150, almost 200 years past slavery at this point? How are they ever going to get ahead, right? If you don't in some way understand that they're already starting out with a disadvantage, right? That's entirely what stuff like affirmative action is for, is to try and say, okay, they're starting out at a worse outcome, so we need to control for that, and therefore have a little bit of a lower bar. Therefore, as we move forward, they have better outcomes, their kids have better outcomes, and then it's sort of a self-perpetuating thing. You can't just control for everything and be like, see, it's the same, and it's like, well, yeah, but that implies that the starting point for black and white people in this country is the same, when it isn't.
And it's hard to see how this could be driven by racism instead of just economic rationality. And on top of all of that, we have studies done on several thousand banks which have found that black-owned banks actually discriminate far more harshly against black people than did the white-owned banks. So it would seem that racism can't really explain these things.
Yes, they can. You can be black and racist. Also, are all the lenders who work there black? Even if they are, you don't have to be a white person to be racist, John.
And if it can, why are black people more racist against black people than white people are? But another thing that we hear about often is redlining. And so for those unfamiliar, the idea is that in the early 20th century, the government created maps that classified certain neighborhoods as high risk as it pertains to investment. And one of the variables that they used when estimating an area's degree of risk was that area's racial composition, which resulted in lenders being less likely to loan to people living in these areas. And so the idea is that black people are at a disadvantage for getting loans because of where they live. And so one thing that I want to point out is that because of that factor being weighed, a white person living in a heavily black neighborhood is going to be impacted by the race of his neighbors just as much as a black person. So the description.
Okay, that's still wrong, John. It still affects more black people because the entire redlining process is used in order to target black people. It doesn't matter if white people get caught in the crossfire. That's an after effect, not the purpose.
Discrimination isn't actually direct discrimination because it applies equally to everybody.
This is like saying, hey, you know what? I burned down that black guy's house because he's black. But you know what? The flames spread to his neighbor's house and he was white. So, I guess it wasn't racist. That's incredibly stupid, John. Do you understand what you're saying? Like, just because there is sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Just because there's collateral damage in racist policymaking doesn't mean it's not racist, you fucking idiot.
Who lives in the neighborhood, regardless of race, if that makes sense. And that's not to justify the practice, but I think it's worth noting. So anyways, that's the idea. And so what we find is that upon controlling for the economically relevant co-founders, the probability of people getting a loan has no relation with the racial composition of their neighborhoods. We found this in Pittsburgh. We found this in Toledo, we found this in Sacramento, we found this in Cleveland, we found this in Boston, etc. And the idea that redlining has...
Interesting that you're not pointing to any national studies or meta-analysis. It's almost like you cherry-picked the ones specifically that don't appear to show the thing you're trying to show doesn't exist. What a shock.
Increased racial inequality because it supposedly made it harder for black people to obtain loans and purchase homes seems unlikely due to the fact that the homeownership gap between black people and white people is similar today to what it was in the 1920s before redlining began, like we talked about earlier. So the idea that black neighborhoods are...
Right, you didn't need redlining in the 1920s because loan officers just all agreed don't give loans to black people because they're black. Duh.
are discriminated against racially in a way that prevents the residents from getting loans. And the idea that this is like tied to redlining from the 1930s doesn't really seem to explain the differences here. And like we said, once you control for the relevant factors, the differences basically disappear. But anyways, moving on to employment, this is something that's often used to explain things like wealth, this idea that black people are discriminated against in the American work environment. Let's just set aside for now the laws put in place to prevent that, so we can talk about the
Okay, there are plenty of laws put in place for a lot of things, but just because it's against the law to rob a bank doesn't mean banks don't need cameras and security guards, you know what I mean? We put laws in place to try and be preventative, but that doesn't mean they work all the time. It doesn't even mean they work most of the time. Smoking weed is illegal in the United States. Tons of people still do it.
infamous study that is often cited by the left. I'm sure that you've heard of it before. It's the study from 2017 that meta-analyzed research on hiring discrimination, and it found that black applicants received 36% fewer callbacks than white applicants, even with their applications being identical in every way other than the race implied by the applicant's name. And this type of evidence is like the quintessential evidence of obvious racism in America, not only in employment, but just in the entire country. And it's said to showcase how black Americans are held back in the economy. And yeah, on the surface, seems like that could be the case, but then we dig a bit deeper. Turns out not actually the case. Basically, the problem with the study is that the discrimination wasn't about perceived race. It was about perceived class. It wasn't that the names sounded black, but rather that they sounded like the names of lower class people.
And John, question, what do you think would make people draw a correlation between being lower class and being black? Fucking idiot.
And we can confirm that this is the case because
that's racist in and of itself, John. If you are looking at a name that's like Devon Marshall or something, I don't know, something that sounds like a stereotypically black name, and your brain automatically goes, low class, that's racist. You fucking moron. I can't believe he's like, actually, it's not because they're black. It's because the people who looked at them thought all black people were poor. Checkmate. Do you see that's as bad, if not worse? Do you see that? He's so stupid.
There was a study done using data from the census to find the most common black names and the most common white names, and they did the same experiment, and they found zero evidence for discrimination against race. So again, it's not about race, it's about class.
John, if someone who's named, like, I don't know, DeMarcus, I don't know, whatever, doesn't get a job because someone views their name as being low class and it's a stereotypically black name, that's a problem in and of itself, John, that is related to racism. Do you get that? Do you understand?
Jamal, which is the name used in the study, is going to receive less callbacks than John, but so are Travis and Cletus. And ignoring that, to return to what we were talking about earlier, assuming the discrimination is true, if you gave me a choice between a completely neutral system or one where I can only apply to 2/3 the jobs as everyone else, but I'm over 20 times more likely to get into an elite school with the same qualifications as everyone else, honestly, I'd probably take the latter option. But the difference is that the former scenario...
How about neither, John? How about we don't have discrimination practices against black people in hiring? How about that? That'd be great.
Being discrimination has been disproven, whereas the latter scenario still occurs. So to just label this as white privilege is incorrect. But besides that, since the 1960s, all employees of the federal government and most employees of the state and local government...
Baja Blast has a link. Hold on. Oh, God. Why can't I just jump to the bottom of chat? There we go. Are Emily and Greg more employable than Lakeisha and Jamal? A field experiment on labor market discrimination. We study race and labor markets by sending fictitious resumes to help wanted ads in Boston and Chicago newspapers to manipulate perceived race. Resumes are randomly assigned African American or white-sounding names. White names receive 50% more callbacks for interviews. Callbacks are also more responsive to resume quality for white names than for African American ones. The racial gap is uniform across occupation, industry, and employer size. We also find little evidence that employers are inferring social class from names. So it literally says we also find little evidence that employers are inferring social class from the names. Differential treatment by race still appears to be prominent in the U.S. labor market. So they literally say they don't have evidence that this is about social class. And he's talking about a different study that has the most common names among African Americans. Most common names for African Americans. African American first names. I'm looking for most common, though, not just like, you know, common African American names. Okay, but see, the most common boy names are things like Anthony, Brandon, Caleb, Cameron, Christian. Like, these don't sound like, if I saw this, I wouldn't know the race of the person. So if, John, you're citing a study that uses these names, which appear to be like the most common African American names, then that doesn't show anything, specifically because these names don't imply any specific race. That was the entire point of the study, John, to say, like, this name is by everyone's standard of reasonability probably the name of an African American individual. You can't just say, well, we'll put Anthony and we'll pretend that that means that they're black, even though, like, that's a name that isn't, like, racially stereotyped. It's stupid. That's a stupid point to make, John.
Governments, including those working under contract, have been required to engage in affirmative action programs to increase the prevalence of minorities in their workforces.
He sounds like this lady, someone says. Hold on, let me click on it. Very stupid.
And as of 2017, there are like 14 million government workers, which account for about 9% of all the workers in the economy. So that's something to consider. And affirmative action isn't just mandated in the public sector. Like, it's also done voluntarily by businesses, just as is the case with the universities. It's like woke capitalism.
With another
there was a report done in 2017 on all the companies in the S&P 100.
Hannah,
What?
you missed the best part of that video.
What?
The lady says she doesn't like geographical names. Her daughter's
There's
name
nothing
is
funny about
India.
the tools of
Her daughter's name is India. Oh, I missed it. I'm sorry. Altered Britain with 10 bits. I remember hearing of a study that used common African American last names as opposed to first, and it made less of a difference. I remember it from when I was a chud, so I don't know how legit it was. Yeah, I'd have to look at it.
And it found that over 90% of them had engaged in diversity initiatives, and 75% of them had gone as far as setting hiring targets for minority employment. And it also found that these types of practices are rapidly gaining in popularity. Also, that study we mentioned earlier suggested that the callback racism against black people has increased since the 1970s, but that doesn't make any sense given that America is obviously less racist and has a more diverse workforce since then. So
I don't know about that. I don't know if I would say that, John. I would say especially amongst people who work in the hiring sector, people who tend to work for hiring, I don't know if we can say that people are less racist. Because look at you, John. You're clearly incredibly racist, but you do the whole mask on thing. So while I would say that society has successfully gotten open racists out of many avenues of public life. Like, you can't go out and just say, like, I hate black people. Like, that's fucked up. And you're rightfully gonna get, like, either punched in the face, or people are just gonna, like, shun you from society, basically. Which is good. However, that doesn't change the fact that people, again, are still racist. They just hold it in more and don't express it, because they know what will happen otherwise.
So given that that's the case, why would the gap widen? How is this country and its systems simultaneously increased and decreased in their racism? Perhaps it actually has nothing to do with racism. But anyways, from there we can get into income, which is actually pretty quick. The left will claim that there's a wage gap between white people and black people, just like between men and women, and Asian people and white people, but
Yes, and if you're about to say something along the lines of, it's actually not a wage gap, white people just tend to go for higher paying jobs, like, yeah, that's part of what that means. An occupation gap can be part of the wage gap.
When you control for education, cognitive skill, marital status, and the region in which someone lives, black people actually make more money than white people.
Again, John, but you're controlling for things that you shouldn't be controlling for because a higher percentage of black people come from poverty and come from lower education. You shouldn't control for those things because those are the factors that are affecting the stats, right?
And to this, the left might hop around to racism in the education system leading to this, but we've already gone over that. So that pretty much answers that. So from there, we can get into our last one, which is crime or the justice system in general. So firstly, I'm going to unapologetically link you to another video that I did a little while ago, in which I go through all the most common arguments about racist police and the racist criminal justice system. It's going to be of great use to you, and that way I don't have to sit here and repeat myself, since we've already been going for a thick minute now. But there are a few things that I'd like to add right now. So typically what we see from the left...
Stephen J. Neptune Man with 50 bits. Isn't it possible to be discriminated on and based on class and because of race? Yeah, I think so. Cleanse that I think everyone would very much enjoy. Yeah, after this one we'll do a cleanse.
The recipient
left with this type of stuff is research that compares the legal outcomes for criminals after controlling for observable, that's important, observable differences between criminals, like types of crime committed, criminal history, stuff like that. And so from there, you can separate these studies into those that measure pretrial outcomes with those that measure post-trial outcomes. So with pretrial outcomes, there was a meta-analysis done in 2016 that looked at 36 studies on the effect that race has on the probability that a defendant would be fully charged. And this is important because 80% of cases at the state level and 90% of cases at the federal level never even go to trial. And it found that black defendants are 9% more likely than white defendants to be charged. But then in the moderator analysis, it found that there are a few other things worth noting, such as that this effect is only found in the South, which is interesting because it kind of, we think of that stereotype where all the racist people live in the South, but there's also a lot of black people in the South. So that's interesting. But it was also...
Okay, so there is a bias then, John. You've just admitted that especially in the South, which is going to tend to be more racist, gee, I wonder why. There's a 9% difference in conviction rate for people who are picked up for crimes, or charge rates, sorry.
Interesting because there was no bias found in studies that reported their standard error. And in statistics, the standard error is the number that tells us how accurate a sample is to the population which it's meant to represent. So that's pretty important. And so when the authors of this study didn't have one to work with, they just estimated it. And then they wrote that it was this estimation of the missing standard error that overestimated or underestimated the effect of race and ethnicity on the outcomes of prosecution. So the bias...
Again, you'd have to cite the sources so we can read them. I'm not going to take your conclusions, like, as a given, John.
Bias reported is driven by the 11 studies that failed to report their standard error. And the best explanation for the fact that there was no bias found in the 25 studies that did report their standard error is that the finding of bias when all the studies are combined is a statistical error, which means that it either doesn't exist or it exists in such a small capacity that it's basically irrelevant. And on top of that, this difference hasn't changed.
You didn't cite any of these 26 studies that you're talking about. Why would we take what you're saying seriously if you're not going to cite any of them?
Over time, which is the opposite of what we would expect if it were being caused by racial bias, since the country has become less racist and we have more non-white people.
Again, you say less racist. I don't know. I really don't. Especially after, like, some of the stuff I've seen online, right? I don't think people are less racist. I think people are more apt to hide their racism, and there is a difference.
Occupying these institutions. So from there, we can look at the post-trial data, but the problem with these studies is that we find that the ones that display larger effects are more likely to be published, which demonstrates bias on the part of the authors, and oftentimes they have unreliable confidence intervals.
Well, how do you know about unpublished papers, John? You don't work in academia in any sort of sociological statistics field, so why are you saying that only the ones that find a difference are published? How many unpublished academic papers do you read? Like, what are you talking about? Basically, it sounds like you found a bunch of stats and papers that show a difference, and in order to cope, you're basically saying, well, I bet a bunch of unpublished ones say something different. Well, you could say that about anything, John, so it's not really a substantive comment to make, is it? Thank you to Archangel 13579 for gifting a sub.
Spanning from like as low as 7%, which literally
yeah, you can send a link.
Means that they are potentially as little as 7% confidence in their results. So what we would need from these types of studies is something that controlled for publication bias and something that only included studies that included controls for obvious differences in crime types and criminal history. But since the studies that have done things like this have reduced the significance of the findings, we can't really say yet what this research is actually finding, let alone that it's finding evidence of racial bias, since it actually suggests the opposite when done properly. And
when done properly. When he says when done properly, he means when it comes to the conclusions that he agrees with.
Top of that, research on trial outcomes is inherently flawed because of what we talked about earlier, because of observational data, which means that there are so many variables that could affect these things that it would be almost impossible to measure it like in a study.
Oh, so you understand that that exists, but when we're talking about differences in outcomes for black and white students in different districts, you don't think that that falls into that category, even though it very clearly does. Interesting.
There are things that could actually explain these outcomes instead of just assuming that it's because of race. Things like...
Hold on, let me get this link. Okay. Just wanted to make sure it was fine.
the way in which the crimes were committed that are still classified as the same type of crime, the motivations behind these things, even the way that people present themselves in court, how remorseful they appear to be, how respectful or disrespectful they are. I mean, these are very important factors that in these cases, and they just can't really be controlled for in these.
Okay, and I would argue the same thing about school districts and how they operate on lower funded inner city, mostly black schools. Sorry, I'm misspeaking a lot today. Mostly black schools.
Types of studies. Now, a way that we can get around.
And again, John, the fact that you're saying this specifically in the instance where the data shows you're wrong tells me that you're not arguing in good faith, and that very specifically, you just disagree when it doesn't fit your preconceived bias.
Around that would be by gathering experimental data. Things like experiments with mock juries, for example, where basically people are assigned to two groups, and in one group the defendant is a black person, and the other group the defendant is a white person, and that is literally the only difference between them. The cases are otherwise identical, which means that everything is controlled for, and they have to vote guilty or not guilty. And so there was a meta-analysis done in 2005 on 34 of these, which found that whites have nearly no bias in such decisions, but black people actually have an in-group bias that is 15 times larger than the in-group bias displayed by white people.
Thank you to Thrash Mio with 95 bits. I know you got a lot of cleanse videos, but here's an interesting scientific video. Oh my gosh, I have so many. Oh, that was Wing the Ultimate Nug. Thrash Mio says potential cleanse. I have so many cleanses. We're gonna get to so few of these today. I'll save them. I'll start a thing that's like a cleanse file. Thank you, Archangel 13579 for 50 bits.
So that means that black people were 15 times more likely to say that the black person was innocent than the white people were to say that the white person was innocent.
Probably due to the fact that black people understand that there is a bias in both policing and arrests and charging for black people. So they're probably more likely to understand mitigating factors that might have led to the arrest.
And then when it came to deciding the lengths of the sentences, if they were guilty, white people had nearly no bias at all, whereas black people had a bias that was 7.6 times greater than the white people. And that doesn't mean the bias displayed by black people in both cases is a huge deal, but we're comparing things along the lines of race. And so it is worth noting that relative to white people, black people had these biases in a much greater capacity. And then there was a meta-analysis done in 2014 that found that white jurors had no bias against black defendants, but again,
Doubt.
Black jurors displayed a pro-black or anti-white bias. So on the one hand, these
Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis.
experiments are good because if there is bias found in observational studies, we can reasonably ascertain that it's because those studies can't control for all the relevant variables, whereas experimental research can. Another thing that's important is the bias that might be held by lawyers and judges that could have an effect on these things. Sometimes the left will claim that black-sounding names receive fewer callbacks from lawyers than do white-sounding names, which could have an effect. But the problem is that this has been found to be equal between white and black lawyers, so that would suggest that it's not...
Okay, what do you not understand, John? White people are not the only people that can be racist. Look at Jesse Lee fucking Peterson, for example. Anyone can have bias against certain groups of people, even if it's a group that they're a part of.
Racially motivated.
Look at Blair White, for instance. Blair White's trans, but she also really seems to hate a lot of trans people. You know what I mean? You can have in-group bias against your own group. I know that's wild, but it is unfortunately a thing.
And as far as judges go, there was a study done which analyzed data on 40,000 sentences that were given between 1991 and 1994, and it found that being black had no impact on a person's sentence between white and black judges. So in other words, black people were treated the same by white and black judges. And then there was another one that looked at data from 35,000 trials which took place between 1968 and 1974, and it found the same thing. Black and white judges treated black defendants the same with respect to whether they were guilty or innocent, and also to the lengths of their sentences. And so the fact that this bias is found equally between black and white judges and lawyers suggests that it's not actually bias, and it's actually due to other things that can't be accounted for in the standard.
Why? Again, I've already stated, black people can be racist, John. What don't you get?
Research. So we could conclude, it's that black and white people are equally racist against black people, but there's no...
Depending. I'm sure there are plenty of black people who are, again, I'll cite Jesse Lee Peterson as a source on this one. There are people who are African American who really, really don't like themselves or the African American community. I would imagine especially in roles like, how do I put this? That self-hate can probably transform into a disdain for people who they view as lesser than themselves. Like, let's say you're a judge. Let's say you're African American and you are able to climb your way out of a bad situation caused by your race, and you're able to become a judge. You're probably going to have a bias against other people who are black because you're going to say, well, why didn't you do what I did? Even though, presumably, a lot of luck went into the fact that that judge was able to, against all odds, go ahead and become a judge. And not just because they're black, but because it's really difficult to not only go to law school, succeed, become a lawyer, and then become a judge, right? There are so many factors that go against that once you get there and you succeed, you might have a bias, a success bias, thinking that, well, I did it, why can't anyone else do it,
No evidence to suggest that, and given that black people in general tend to have a much...
Can you give the sub you won from bingo to someone else? Sure.
Stronger in-group bias than whites do, and no demonstrable anti-black bias. This seems to be a baseless speculation. So it would seem that our justice system, just like everything else we've covered, differences do exist, but they're not racially motivated. They're not because of racism or a racist system or a racial bias.
Your evidence for that was that you think black people can't be racist, which is ridiculous. Sorry, I'm looking for the notepad. I keep the...
Bias. I mean, these are all sophomoric, knee-jerk, virtue signaling diagnoses of the problem.
Nope. John, virtue signaling doesn't fucking exist the way you think it does. You think that anyone who has a different opinion than you on something is automatically virtue signaling. It isn't the case.
And again, the reason that we point this out isn't because we don't care about the problems or even because we want to indict black people or criticize black people. It's really because we want to firstly exonerate white people in America for the blame, since that's just not true, and it's the popular narrative right now, and it's destructive, and it's poison.
No one's blaming you individually as a white person, John. We're talking about systematic issues, right? Calm down.
And it's false and it's evil. But also because...
Although you particularly are part of the problem just because you're a shitbag, but that's different than everything else we're talking about.
Ideally, we want to be united as a country, and so to do that requires solving the problems that we face as Americans. But like I said earlier, incorrectly diagnosing problems brings us no closer to solving them, and it wastes a lot of time and resources in the process. And in this particular case, it would seem that their overriding ambition is really just to destroy the country, and I can't allow that to happen.
Destroy the country? Hyperbolic much? Jesus.
We can't allow that to happen, and it wouldn't even solve the problem. So yeah, we can move on now. I've ended racism once and for all. Here's a video of me doing it.
Stop. Stop being racist. Now. That's enough. No more racism. That's not cool. That's not funny or edgy. Cut it out. Stop being racist.
Should have saved this for Captain Cringe.
Stop being racist. Stop being racist.
This goes on way too long. Like, even if it was funny, this would be, like, way too long.
Channel.
Jesus Christ, John. Alright, so there's a shitty video in which he misrepresented a lot of shit and didn't cite any of his sources in the description. So good job, John. Nailing it as always. See you next time. I lurk on your Discord, I guess.